The weight of the rope. The rope had been hanging over Hacksaw Ridge for 3 days, its manila fibers darkening with rain and blood. Desmond Doss wrapped his hands around it one more time, feeling the rough texture that had become as familiar as his own skin. Below, in the pre-dawn darkness of April 1945, the 77th Infantry Division's aid station buzzed with quiet activity. Medics checking supplies, stretcher-bearers testing their gear, officers huddled over maps that seemed to change every few hours as the Okinawan campaign ground forward. "Doc, you sure that thing's gonna hold?" The voice belonged to Private Martinez, a rifleman from Charlie Company who'd been watching Doss prepare for another ascent. His tone carried equal parts admiration and worry, the kind of concern that had become common among the men who'd witnessed what the medic could do with nothing but medical supplies and stubborn faith. "It's held this long," Doss replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The rope represented something more than equipment now. It was a lifeline that connected the wounded scattered across the ridge's plateau to the possibility of seeing home again. Each time he'd used it to lower men to safety, the fibers had stretched a little more, frayed a little deeper, yet somehow maintained their integrity. Above them, Hacksaw Ridge rose like a wall of coral and volcanic rock, its sheer face carved by centuries of Pacific storms. The Japanese had turned the plateau into a fortress of caves and tunnels, positions that could rake the entire top with crossfire while remaining nearly invisible to American forces below. 3 assaults had failed to secure lasting footholds, leaving wounded scattered across the exposed ground like broken dolls. Lieutenant Bradley approached through the morning mist, his uniform still bearing mudstains from the previous night's evacuation attempts. The company commander had aged years in the past week, the weight of sending men up that rope ladder and cliff face etched into the lines around his eyes. "Doss, we've got reports of movement up there. Probably 15, maybe 20 men still alive, but can't make it to the rope on their own. Division wants us to wait for artillery support before attempting any more rescues, but that's hours away." The medic nodded, understanding the unspoken conflict. Military protocol demanded they wait for proper support, coordinate with other units, minimize risk to rescue personnel. But wounded men didn't follow protocols. They bled out according to their own desperate timeline, calling for help that might never come. Martinez shifted his weight, rifle slung across his shoulders in a way that emphasized what Doss carried instead. Bandages, morphine, sulfur powder, and an unwavering conviction that he could not leave the ridge while men still needed him. The contrast had caused friction early in their deployment, but after witnessing rescue after rescue, even the most skeptical soldiers had stopped questioning the medic's methods. "What's the count so far, Doc?" Martinez asked quietly. 75 men, Doss answered, though he'd long since stopped keeping precise tallies. Each face remained clear in his memory, the young Marine who'd whispered his mother's name, the sergeant who'd pressed a photograph into Doss's hands, the rifleman who'd laughed weakly about missing his wedding anniversary. Numbers felt inadequate to capture what each descent meant. The rope swayed slightly in the morning breeze, and Doss found himself studying its condition with the eye of someone whose life depended on its reliability. The upper section showed significant wear where it rubbed against the ridge's limestone edge. The middle portion had been spliced twice after taking mortar fragments, yet it continued to hold, bearing weight that should have snapped manila fibers days ago. Dr. Vernon Stems, the battalion surgeon, emerged from the aid station tent with the resigned expression of a man who'd learned not to argue with miracles he couldn't explain. He'd been the one receiving the wounded as they reached the bottom, triaging injuries and coordinating evacuation to rear hospitals. "That rope shouldn't be holding," he said to no one in particular. "Engineering specs say Manila breaks at 800 pounds distributed load. You've been lowering 160, 180-pound men for 3 days straight." "Maybe it knows something we don't," Doss replied, checking his medical kit one final time. The contents had been improvised from multiple sources. Standard field dressings, supplemented with torn undershirts, morphine syrettes carefully rationed, sulfur powder that he'd learned to apply with the precision of a pharmacist. Lieutenant Bradley pulled out a worn map, pointing to grid coordinates that had become meaningless after days of shifting battle lines. Intelligence thinks the Japanese pulled back to deeper cave positions during the night. Might give you a window to reach the wounded before they reoccupy forward positions. The medic nodded, though they all knew intelligence reports from the ridge had proven unreliable. Cave networks allowed enemy forces to appear and disappear like ghosts, making any tactical prediction little more than educated guessing. What mattered was the certainty that wounded Americans lay exposed on ground no one else seemed willing to cross. Martinez stepped closer to the rope, running his own hands along its length with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read equipment failures before they became fatal. "Doc, what do you see up there that the rest of us miss?" Doss considered the question, looking up at the ridge's silhouette against the lightening sky. "Same thing you see. The difference is what I can't see that keeps me going back." The answer hung in the air like morning mist, carrying implications none of them wanted to examine too closely. Below, stretcher-bearers continued their preparations, checking buckles and testing canvas that had been patched and repatched until it resembled a quilt more than military equipment. Above, Hacksaw Ridge waited with the patient menace of a predator that had learned to let prey come to it. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The ascent began in darkness, Doss's boots finding purchase on the rain-slick limestone face of Hacksaw Ridge, while his hands worked the rope with practiced efficiency. Behind him, the sounds of the 77th Infantry Division's morning preparations faded into whispered radio chatter and the distant clatter of equipment being positioned for another day of siege warfare. The Okinawan plateau above remained silent, but it was the kind of silence that pressed against his ears like an accusation. Halfway up, he paused at a narrow ledge where previous climbers had worn handholds into the coral. The rope stretched above and below him, disappearing into shadow at both ends, connecting worlds that felt increasingly disconnected from each other. Below lay the relative safety of American positions, medical supplies, and officers who understood war in terms of objectives and acceptable losses. Above waited something that defied those calculations, wounded men scattered across ground that belonged neither to strategy nor tactics, but to the simple mathematics of blood loss and time. "Easy does it, Doc," came a whispered voice from above. Sergeant Murphy, a squad leader from Baker Company who'd been wounded in the previous day's action but had insisted on staying to help coordinate rescues. His leg wound kept him from making the climb himself, but his knowledge of the ridge's layout had proven invaluable. "How many can you count from up there?" Doss called softly. 7, maybe 8 still moving. Hard to tell with the smoke from those burning stumps. Murphy's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been watching wounded men for hours, calculating which injuries could wait and which demanded immediate attention. Doss completed the climb, pulling himself over the edge onto the plateau of Hacksaw Ridge. The landscape that greeted him seemed sculpted by artillery and desperation, shelled craters filled with rainwater, broken tree stumps that provided minimal cover, and scattered equipment from multiple failed assaults. The morning light revealed details that night operations had mercifully hidden. Bloodstains on rock, abandoned rifles half buried in mud, personal items that told stories no after-action report would ever capture. The first wounded man lay 30 yards from the rope, partially hidden behind an overturned ammunition crate. Private Collins, a replacement who'd been with the unit less than 2 weeks, had taken shrapnel in both legs and was trying to apply pressure to wounds that clearly required more medical attention than field-expedient bandaging could provide. "Collins, I'm coming to you," Doss called, keeping his voice low while scanning the tree line for movement. Japanese positions remained invisible, but experience had taught him that invisibility didn't mean absence. Enemy observers could be tracking his movement through rifle scopes, waiting for the right moment to engage. "Doc, they're still out there," Collins whispered as Doss reached his position. "Saw muzzle flashes from those caves maybe 20 minutes ago. They're watching." Doss began working on the wounded man's legs, applying proper field dressings while his mind automatically calculated blood loss, shock progression, and the time required to get Collins to the rope. The shrapnel had missed major arteries, but infection remained a serious concern in the humid climate of Okinawa, where even minor wounds could become life-threatening without proper treatment. "We're going to get you down from here," he said, wrapping pressure bandages with the mechanical precision of someone who'd performed the same procedure dozens of times. "That rope's been holding all week. It'll hold for you too." "Doc, why do you keep coming back up here?" Collins asked, his voice mixing pain medication and genuine curiosity. "You could stay down there with the aid station. Nobody would blame you." The question struck deeper than shrapnel, touching something Doss had been avoiding since the first day on Hacksaw Ridge. Military regulations didn't require medics to operate alone in contested areas. Common sense suggested that individual heroics often created more casualties than they prevented. Yet something about the ridge demanded responses that transcended regulations and common sense. "Can't leave while you're still up here," Doss replied, testing the security of his bandage work. Simple as that. But it wasn't simple, and they both knew it. Each return trip to the plateau represented a choice that grew more difficult to explain or justify. The rope had become a symbol of something larger than medical protocol, a physical manifestation of the belief that no wounded man should die alone while help remained possible. Movement in the tree line caught Doss's attention, and he instinctively pressed Collins lower against their improvised cover. Shadows shifted among the broken stumps, and the unmistakable sound of equipment being repositioned echoed across the plateau. Japanese forces were adjusting their positions, possibly preparing for another engagement as American forces regrouped below. "How many more, Doc?" Collins asked, following Doss's gaze toward other wounded scattered across the ridge. "Enough," Doss answered, beginning the careful process of moving Collins toward the rope. Always enough. The movement to the cliff edge required 15 minutes of careful maneuvering, using shell craters and debris for concealment while supporting Collins's weight. The wounded rifleman tried to help, but his leg injuries made coordination difficult, turning what should have been a simple movement into an exercise in patience and improvisation. At the rope, Doss rigged a simple harness using parachute cord and canvas strapping, creating a system that would allow Collins to descend safely while maintaining pressure on his wounds. The manila fibers felt solid under his hands, though he could see new fraying where the rope contacted the ridge's edge. "Tell them I'll be sending more down," Doss instructed as he prepared to lower Collins, "and tell Dr. Stems the rope's holding, but barely." "What about you, Doc? When do you come down?" Doss looked back across the plateau, where morning light was revealing the full extent of wounded still requiring evacuation. 7 men, for certain, possibly more in areas he hadn't yet searched. Each represented hours of medical work and dangerous movement across exposed ground. "When everyone's down," he answered, beginning Collins's descent. Not before. By mid-morning, the rope had taken on a life of its own, stretching and contracting with each descent like a living thing fighting to maintain its integrity. Doss had lowered 4 more men since Collins, and each evacuation left the manila fibers thinner, more frayed, held together by what felt increasingly like will rather than tensile strength. Below, the 77th Infantry Division's aid station had become a study in controlled chaos as medical personnel processed wounds that ranged from treatable to heartbreaking. Dr. Stems worked with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned to compartmentalize emotion, his hands moving through triage procedures while his mind tracked supplies, personnel, and the impossible mathematics of battlefield medicine. Each man coming down the rope represented a victory, but also a drain on morphine, plasma, and bandages that were already running dangerously low. "How's he doing it?" asked Cortman Williams, a Navy medic attached to the Marines who'd been watching the evacuations with professional amazement. "That rope should have snapped hours ago. Those wounds should have killed half these men before they reached us." "I stopped asking questions like that," Stems replied, checking the pulse of a wounded sergeant who'd arrived unconscious but was beginning to stir under treatment. "Started accepting miracles instead of explaining them." Above them, Hacksaw Ridge had settled into an uneasy quiet that experienced soldiers recognized as more dangerous than active combat. Silence meant observation, calculation, and preparation for something that hadn't happened yet. Japanese forces were adjusting their strategy, possibly massing for a counterattack that would make further rescue operations impossible. Lieutenant Bradley monitored radio traffic from multiple units, trying to piece together a tactical picture that changed faster than reports could relay. Other sections of the Okinawan front were reporting increased enemy activity, suggesting a coordinated response to American gains of the previous week. Time was running out for individual heroics. "Doss, can you hear me up there?" he called toward the ridge using a field telephone line that had been rigged alongside the rope. "I can hear you, Lieutenant," came the reply, slightly distorted by static and distance. "Got 3 more ready for evacuation. Wounds are manageable, but they need real medical attention soon." "What's your assessment of enemy activity?" "Quiet. Too quiet. Think they're waiting for something." Bradley exchanged glances with Stems, both recognizing the implications. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized patience, allowing American forces to commit to exposed positions before launching coordinated counterattacks. The longer Doss remained on the plateau, the greater the chance he'd be caught in something that would prevent any evacuation. "Doc, Division is recommending we pull back and wait for artillery support," Bradley said into the handset. "We can shell the ridge and try again tomorrow with proper infantry support." The response took longer than usual, and when it came, Doss's voice carried a tone they'd never heard before, something that mixed exhaustion with resolve, and perhaps a touch of something that might have been desperation. "Lieutenant, there are men up here who won't be alive tomorrow. I can't leave them." The finality in those words settled over the aid station like morning mist, touching everyone within hearing. Martinez set down his rifle and walked to the base of the rope, running his hands along its length with the attention of someone examining a lifeline. "This thing's gonna break," he said to no one in particular. "Physics says it's gotta break." "Physics said a lot of things this week," Williams observed, preparing plasma bottles for the next evacuees. "Haven't seen much physics up there. Seen something else." Above them, Doss was working on a wounded Marine whose injuries required delicate handling, internal bleeding that made movement dangerous, but delay potentially fatal. The young man, barely 19, had been calling for his mother when Doss found him sheltered behind a shattered palm tree. Now he lay quiet, conserving strength for a descent that would require every ounce of will he could manage. "What's your name, son?" Doss asked, while rigging the evacuation harness. "Peterson, sir. Tommy Peterson from Nebraska." "Well, Tommy, we're gonna get you off this ridge and back to Nebraska. Rope's been working all week, and it's gonna work for you too." "Doc, why aren't you scared?" Peterson asked, his voice weak but curious. "Everyone else is scared up here." The question stopped Doss's hands for a moment, forcing him to examine something he'd been avoiding since the first climb. Fear was present, had been present from the beginning. Fear of the rope breaking, of enemy fire, of failing the men who trusted him. But stronger than fear was something else, something that kept his hands steady while lowering wounded men into darkness. "I am scared," he admitted, testing Peterson's harness one final time. "But I'm more scared of what happens if I don't do this." The descent took 20 minutes. Peterson's weight causing new stress fractures in rope fibers that were already operating beyond their design limits. At the bottom, Medical personnel received him with the practiced efficiency of an assembly line, moving him quickly to the treatment area where Dr. Stems could assess internal injuries. "How many more?" Stems asked when Doss's voice crackled through the field telephone. "Two for certain, maybe a third if I can reach him. Doc, that rope can't take much more stress. Each descent is weakening the whole system." "I know, but they're still up here." The conversation ended in static, leaving the aid station to contemplate mathematics that didn't balance. Wounded men who needed evacuation versus equipment that couldn't possibly support more stress. Yet the rope continued to hold, stretching and fraying, but maintaining its essential integrity, like a physical manifestation of something that transcended engineering specifications. Martinez began checking his own equipment, adjusting straps and testing buckles with unusual care. Williams noticed the behavior and moved closer. "What are you thinking, Marine?" "Thinking that Doc might need someone to help him get down when this is over," Martinez replied. "And thinking that rope might not hold for both of them unless someone goes up to help." The implication hung in the morning air like cordite, carrying weight that no one wanted to acknowledge directly. Below, stretcher bearers continued their preparations, while above, Hacksaw Ridge waited with the patience of something that had already claimed too many lives to be impressed by individual acts of courage. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The rope sang with tension as Doss prepared for what he knew would be its final test. Two wounded Marines lay 30 yards apart on the plateau of Hacksaw Ridge, their injuries requiring evacuation within the hour, or they would join the silent forms already scattered across the contested ground. The manila fibers had stretched to nearly twice their original length, individual strands separating under stress that should have caused catastrophic failure hours earlier. Private First Class Howard, the nearest wounded man, had taken a rifle bullet through the shoulder that had nicked his lung. Each breath produced a wet sound that Doss recognized as potentially fatal without immediate surgical intervention. The second man, Corporal Zhang, lay partially concealed in a shell crater 40 yards away, conscious but unable to move due to shrapnel wounds in both legs. "Doc, I can hear them moving around in those caves," Howard whispered as Doss worked to stabilize his breathing. "Think they're getting ready for something big?" Doss nodded while applying pressure bandages, his experienced hands reading the wound's severity through touch and observation. The bullet had entered cleanly, but its path through Howard's torso remained unclear. Movement could cause internal bleeding that would kill him before he reached medical attention, yet staying on the ridge guaranteed death from exposure or enemy action. "We're gonna take this real slow," Doss said, beginning to rig an evacuation harness that would minimize stress on Howard's injuries. "That rope's gotten us this far. It's gonna get you home, too." The rigging process required 15 minutes of careful work, creating a system that would support Howard's weight while preventing movement that could worsen internal injuries. Doss had improvised similar harnesses throughout the week, but each variation taught him something new about human anatomy under stress and the improvised engineering of battlefield medicine. At the cliff edge, the rope showed visible signs of imminent failure. Individual fibers had snapped under stress, leaving the remaining strands to bear weight they were never designed to carry. Yet something about its construction, or perhaps something beyond engineering, continued to provide the tensile strength necessary for evacuation operations. "Howard, when you get down there, tell Dr. Stems this is probably the last trip," Doss instructed while preparing the descent system. "Tell him there's one more man up here, but the rope might not make it." "What about you, Doc? How do you get down?" The question had been haunting Doss since morning, though he'd avoided examining it directly. Military protocol suggested that rescue operations should never place rescuers at greater risk than those being rescued. Common sense dictated that preserving the rope for his own descent should take priority over attempting additional evacuations. Yet Corporal Zhang remained in the crater, wounded, and calling for help that only Doss could provide. "Don't worry about me," he replied, beginning Howard's descent. "Worry about getting better and seeing home again." The lowering operation proceeded with agonizing slowness, each foot of rope requiring careful attention to stress distribution and Howard's medical stability. Halfway down, Doss heard the distinctive snap of individual fibers breaking under load, but the main line continued to hold. At the bottom, medical personnel received Howard with practiced efficiency, immediately beginning treatment for potential internal bleeding. Dr. Stems's voice crackled through the field telephone moments later. "Doss, that rope is finished. You can see broken strands from down here. Do not attempt another evacuation." "There's still one more man up here," Doss replied, already moving toward Zhang's position. "Can't leave him. Doc, listen to me. That rope will not support another descent. You need to come down now while it can still hold your weight." The conversation ended in static, leaving Doss alone with a decision that had no good options. Zhang lay in the crater, semi-conscious and losing blood from multiple shrapnel wounds. Medical attention within the next hour could save him, but delay would almost certainly prove fatal. The rope that had held for over 70 evacuations was clearly at the end of its structural integrity, yet it remained the only means of reaching safety. Doss reached Zhang's position and began immediate medical assessment. The shrapnel wounds were serious but treatable. No major arteries severed, no obvious internal bleeding. With proper field dressing and careful handling, Zhang could survive evacuation. The question was whether the rope could survive Zhang. "Corporal, what's your first name?" Doss asked while applying pressure bandages. "Michael, sir. Michael Zhang from San Francisco." "Well, Michael, we've got a problem. That rope down there has been holding miracles all week, but it's about done. I need you to help me figure out how to get you home." Zhang managed a weak smile despite his pain. "Doc, everyone knows what you've been doing up here. If you say the rope will hold, then it'll hold." The faith in those words struck Doss harder than enemy fire. Throughout the week, wounded men had trusted him with their lives based on nothing more than his presence and the promise that evacuation was possible. Now he faced the mathematics of that trust. Zhang's life versus the rope's remaining integrity versus his own chance of survival if the rope failed. "Michael, I'm going to rig you a harness that distributes your weight as evenly as possible," Doss explained while working. "The rope's going to hold because it has to hold, because you've got people in San Francisco who need you to come home." The rigging took 20 minutes, every knot tested and retested for security. Zhang remained conscious throughout the process, his trust absolute despite obvious evidence of the rope's deteriorating condition. As they moved toward the cliff edge, distant sounds from the tree line suggested Japanese forces were indeed preparing for coordinated action that would make further rescue operations impossible. At the rope, Doss performed one final inspection of the manila fibers. Perhaps 30% of the original strands remained intact, held together by splices, prayers, and something that transcended normal engineering. The rope had become more than equipment. It had evolved into a physical manifestation of the belief that no wounded man should be abandoned while rescue remained theoretically possible. "Zhang, when you get down there, tell them I'll be right behind you," Doss said, beginning the final descent of the week. "Tell them the rope held for everyone who needed it to hold." The lowering operation proceeded in absolute silence, both men understanding that they were testing something beyond the normal limits of manila fiber and human engineering. Halfway down, Doss heard the sound he'd been dreading, multiple fiber breaks occurring in rapid succession. Yet somehow, impossibly, the rope continued to function, lowering Zhang safely to the hands of medical personnel who had gathered to witness what might be the rope's final act. At the bottom, Dr. Stems immediately began triage on Zhang, while other personnel examined the rope's condition. The damage was catastrophic, individual strands hanging loose, splices failing under stress, the entire system held together by perhaps 20% of its original strength. Doss, you need to come down immediately, Stems called through the field telephone. That rope will not support another descent. It should have failed an hour ago. Above them, Hacksaw Ridge settled into afternoon quiet, Japanese positions invisible but certainly occupied, waiting for the American rescue operation to conclude before resuming normal combat operations. Somewhere on the plateau, one unarmed medic contemplated a rope that had defied every engineering prediction and his own chances of survival if it finally decided to obey the laws of physics. The secret that Desmond Doss would carry for the rest of his life began with a sound, not the crack of breaking rope or the whistle of incoming artillery, but the complete silence that settled over Hacksaw Ridge as he stood alone at the cliff edge. 76 men safely evacuated below him, and no way down that didn't violate every principle of physics and probability. The rope hung in tatters, individual strands separated and fraying, held together by splices that should have failed hours earlier, and a structural integrity that existed somewhere beyond the realm of engineering specifications. Dr. Stems had been right. It would not support another descent. Yet here Doss stood, having accomplished something that would become the cornerstone of his Medal of Honor citation, facing the private reality that legends never mentioned, the moment when the hero realizes he may have saved everyone except himself. "Doc, can you hear me?" Lieutenant Bradley's voice crackled through the field telephone, carrying an undertone of desperation that military training couldn't quite suppress. "I can hear you," Doss replied, testing the rope's remaining fibers with hands that had learned to read tensile strength through touch. "How's Jang?" "Jang's stable. Howard's in surgery, but they think he'll make it. Doc, you did it. 76 men. But now we need to get you down from there." The number settled into Doss's consciousness like a physical weight. 76. Each representing a name, a face, a story that would continue because of decisions made on a plateau that logic said no one should survive. Yet the mathematics that made heroes also created impossible situations, and Doss was learning that the gap between legendary actions and personal survival could be measured in frayed rope fibers and failing engineering. Below, Martinez had been studying the cliff face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that involved human life. The rock was limestone and coral, carved by centuries of Pacific storms into a surface that offered few natural handholds. Previous climbing attempts had established that the rope represented the only practical means of ascending or descending the ridge's sheer face. "Stems, what if we rig additional support lines?" Martinez suggested, though his voice carried the doubt of someone proposing solutions he didn't quite believe. "Maybe anchor new rope at multiple points?" "With what rope?" Stems replied, checking supplies that had been depleted by a week of continuous operations. "And how do we get it up there without someone to secure the anchors?" The conversation continued below, while Doss examined options that ranged from impossible to suicidal. The ridge's plateau offered no alternative descent routes. Japanese engineers had selected their defensive position precisely because it channeled American forces into predictable lines of attack and retreat. Caves and tunnel systems that honeycombed the ridge were controlled by enemy forces who had shown no inclination toward prisoner-taking. What haunted Doss, more than physical danger, was the growing realization that his actions throughout the week had been driven by something he couldn't name or explain to himself. Each return trip to the plateau had felt necessary, inevitable, as if refusing to climb the rope would violate some fundamental principle that transcended military orders or personal safety. Now, standing alone at the cliff edge, he was forced to examine the source of that compulsion. "Lord, I need some help here," he whispered, words that would never appear in official reports or citation narratives. "I don't know why you brought me this far just to leave me stranded." The prayer was different from the confident declarations of faith that had sustained him throughout the week. This was the desperate plea of someone who had reached the end of human capability and discovered that divine intervention wasn't always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it was as simple as rope fibers that held longer than physics predicted, or the strength to climb one more time when exhaustion should have made movement impossible. Movement in the tree line caught his attention, and Doss instinctively moved away from the cliff edge toward cover among the shell craters and debris that littered the plateau. Japanese forces were repositioning, possibly preparing to reoccupy forward positions now that American rescue operations appeared to have concluded. Time was running out for any solution that didn't involve a direct confrontation between one unarmed medic and an unknown number of enemy soldiers. The field telephone crackled again. "Doss, we're working on alternatives down here. Can you find cover and wait until dark? Maybe we can improvise something after sunset." "I'll try," he replied, though they both knew that darkness would bring its own dangers. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized night operations, and Doss would be operating alone on terrain that enemy forces knew intimately. His medical kit contained morphine that could ease pain, but no weapons that could prevent capture or worse. As afternoon wore toward evening, Doss found himself returning repeatedly to the rope, testing its condition and calculating odds that never improved no matter how he approached the problem. The manila fibers continued their gradual deterioration, individual strands snapping under tension, while the remaining structure somehow maintained enough integrity to sway in the ocean breeze that swept across Okinawa's high ground. What struck him most powerfully was not fear of death that had been present throughout the week, but the possibility that his story might end not in heroic sacrifice, but in simple miscalculation. The men below had trusted him to find a way down, just as the wounded had trusted him to find a way to evacuate them. Faith was a powerful force, but it operated within physical laws that included gravity, tensile strength, and the mathematical certainties of structural failure. 76, he said aloud, testing how the number sounded when spoken into the growing darkness. 76 men who get to go home. The mathematics of that achievement felt simultaneously overwhelming and insufficient. Each successful evacuation had required split-second decisions, improvised engineering, and physical courage that he'd discovered he possessed only when it was absolutely necessary. Yet standing alone on the ridge, Doss understood that the real test had nothing to do with courage or engineering. It involved faith, not the confident declarations that preceded action, but the quiet trust that continued even when outcomes remained completely uncertain. Below, the aid station continued its work under lantern light, treating wounded who would live because of rope that shouldn't have held and decisions that shouldn't have been survivable. Above, one medic prepared to test whether the same forces that had sustained him throughout the week would prove sufficient for one final descent into darkness, trusting a rope that physics said was already broken and faith that felt equally fragmented. The secret he would carry was not about heroics or miraculous intervention, but about the moment when human capability ended, and something else, call it providence, call it impossibility, call it the stubborn refusal of manila fibers to obey engineering specifications, had to bridge the gap between legendary actions and personal survival. The descent began at 23:47 hours, recorded in Lieutenant Bradley's log as the moment when Desmond Doss trusted his life to rope that every engineer said should have failed hours earlier. What the log couldn't capture was the sound the rope made, not the sharp crack of catastrophic failure, but a gradual groaning that suggested fibers stretching beyond their design limits, while somehow maintaining the essential structure necessary to lower one man safely into the hands of those who had waited below. Martinez was the first to reach him, hands steady as they guided Doss away from the cliff face and towards solid ground that felt impossibly foreign after a week spent on the plateau above. The medic's legs trembled with exhaustion that had been held in check by necessity, but now asserted itself with the weight of accumulated stress and physical demands that no training manual had anticipated. "Doc, how do you know it would hold?" Martinez asked, supporting Doss's weight as they moved toward the aid station. "I didn't," Doss replied, his voice carrying the quiet honesty of someone who had tested the boundaries between faith and physics and found them more complex than either science or theology suggested, just knew it had to. Dr. Stems performed a quick medical assessment, checking for injuries that might have been overlooked in the adrenaline of evacuation operations. Doss was dehydrated, exhausted, and showing early signs of what would later be recognized as combat stress, but physically intact. Around them, the aid station continued processing wounded from throughout the day, each patient representing a story that would intersect with family letters, medical reports, and pension applications that would follow veterans for decades. 76 men, Stems said, though the number felt inadequate to capture what had transpired on the ridge. "The rope should have failed after the first dozen. You should have been killed 3 times over. Someone's going to want explanations for this." "No explanations," Doss replied, accepting a canteen of water and drinking deeply. "Just grateful it worked out the way it did." The rope itself had become an object of fascination for personnel who gathered to examine its condition in the morning light. Individual strands had separated completely in several sections, leaving the remaining fibers to bear stress that should have caused immediate failure. Splices held together by combinations of proper technique and what appeared to be pure determination showed wear patterns that defied normal understanding of manila fiber behavior under load. A week later, Doss sat in a tent at division headquarters while a colonel attempted to compile the official report that would accompany his Medal of Honor recommendation. The officer had spread maps across a field table, marking positions and calculating distances that reduced the week's actions to a series of tactical movements and casualty statistics. "Medic Doss, can you estimate the total time you spent on the plateau during evacuation operations?" "Couldn't say exactly, sir. Time worked differently up there." "And the rope? Engineering reports suggest it should have failed under normal load conditions. Can you explain how it continued to function?" Doss studied the maps, seeing grid coordinates and elevation markers that captured nothing of what the ridge had actually felt like. The weight of wounded men, the sound of prayer whispered between mortar rounds, the texture of manila fibers that had somehow held when everything else seemed to be failing. "No, sir, I can't explain it. Just glad it did what we needed it to do." Years later, when the war had ended and Doss had returned to civilian life, he would sometimes wake in the night to the sound of rain on his roof and find himself thinking about rope fibers and the weight of decisions made on ground that belonged neither to the living nor the dead. The Medal of Honor would hang in a frame, citations would accumulate in files, and reporters would occasionally seek interviews about the man who saved 76 lives on Hacksaw Ridge. But what stayed with him were smaller details: the texture of manila rope worn smooth by repetition, the sound of wounded men breathing as they descended toward safety, and the private knowledge that what others called miraculous had felt from the inside like one terrified decision after another, each made without certainty about outcomes or consequences. His wife would sometimes find him in the garage, working with rope and pulleys on projects that never seemed to reach completion. When she asked about these activities, Doss would explain that he was testing load distributions or practicing knot configurations, though they both understood that what he was really doing was trying to recapture the moment when physics had bent just enough to allow impossible things to become temporarily possible. The rope from Hacksaw Ridge had disappeared into military surplus channels, probably ending up in some depot warehouse where it was classified as damaged equipment and disposed of according to standard procedures. But Doss continued to work with manila fiber whenever possible, his hands reading tensile strength with the sensitivity of someone who had learned to trust his life to materials that operated at the intersection of engineering and faith. Martinez, who had stayed in touch through veterans organizations, visited occasionally to discuss their shared memories of Okinawa and the week that had changed how they understood courage, capability, and the mathematics of survival. They rarely talked directly about the ridge, but their conversations circled around themes of brotherhood, responsibility, and the weight that stayed with those who had witnessed the gap between official reports and lived experience. "Doc, you ever regret going back up there so many times?" Martinez asked during one visit, both men now in their 60s and dealing with the accumulated effects of wartime service. "Can't regret something that brought 76 men home," Doss replied, testing the strength of a rope splice he'd been working on. "But I think about it differently now than I did then." "How so?" "Then, it felt like something I had to do. Now, it feels like something I got to do. The difference is everything." The distinctions settled between them like cordite, carrying implications about memory, service, and the stories societies tell themselves about heroes and the costs of heroism. Below them, in metaphorical terms that both men understood, generations of Americans would learn about Hacksaw Ridge through textbooks and films that captured the dramatic outline of events, while necessarily omitting the private weight of decisions made in darkness by ordinary men who discovered that necessity could reveal capabilities they never knew they possessed. The rope that had held for 76 evacuations lived on in Doss's hands as he worked with similar materials, testing their limits and trusting their strength, searching for the place where human engineering met something larger than itself, and found occasionally that the mathematics of survival included factors that no manual had ever documented or explained. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.